Hey, this is Joe Gilder from the Recording Revolution. Let's talk about mixing drums. I don't know about you, but drum mixing can be really intimidating for folks. Today, I want to kind of break down the barriers and share with you 3 easy, simple, but effective ways that you can mix drums and start getting great sounding drum mixes. It doesn't have to be difficult and it doesn't have to be intimidating. Before we dive in, if you haven't checked out our free guide, this is one that Graham Cochran developed. It'll walk you through his 6-step process for creating radio-ready, radio-friendly recordings and mixes out of your home studio. Go check that out at therecordingrevolution.com. All right, so first off, let's listen to the raw tracks that I've got here for you. The only thing on these tracks is there's an EQ on the room mics, just notching out this nasty 3K ringing that was there. But otherwise, this is just the raw drums. So the first approach that I love to use, and it's my favorite with mixing drums, is something called top-down mixing. If you followed me or Graham Cochran for any length of time, you've probably heard us talk about this. And it's the idea that instead of mixing the individual pieces of the kit first, we're going to start at the bus. What do I mean? Here are these drum tracks that you just heard. These channels here are the drum tracks themselves, and they're all routed to this drum bus. I'll change it to red just to, oh, actually, they all follow the same, they all have the same color because these are all in like a folder, as you can see there. So all of these are routed to this drum bus. And what top-down mixing states, it's kind of like a funnel. We're going to focus on the drum bus first before we go and look at the individual drums. Why would we do that? Well, first of all, people that tend to go in and mix individual pieces of the kit a lot of times still don't have a good sounding drum mix, because what a kick drum sounds like by itself is wildly different from what it sounds like in the mix. For example, here's the kick drum by itself. The big old like 24-inch kick drum. And then here's what the kick drum sounds like in the whole mix. Right? We're getting kick drum sounds from more than just the kick drum mic. We're getting it from the overheads a little bit. We're getting it from the room mic a little bit. And we're getting it from this fat mic, which is a Cascade Fathead ribbon mic that's directly over the kick drum facing the drummer. And it just has this big beefy sound. That's so good. So that's blending in to create the overall sound of our kick drum. So if we were to spend a half an hour just EQing the solo kick drum mic, it may or may not get us results that make any difference, because when we put it back in with everything else, it's going to completely alter the sound. So instead of banging your head against a wall and doing that bottom-up approach, going individual track by track, start at the top down. I don't necessarily mean go all the way to the mix bus, but specifically in this instance, go to the drum bus, put some EQ and compression there, and then work your way backwards only if you need to. I've had some mixes where I haven't needed more than just a few plugins on the drum bus, and I'm good to go. We'll talk about the pros and cons of this top-down method, but let's throw something on here. I'm going to use, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use the Fat Channel plugin, which is a Studio One plugin. I'm going to throw in I'll use the Classic Comp and then the Vintage EQ. Okay, these are very common plugins that you see all over the place. Let's just start with the compressor and see what kind of sound we can get. Again, this is on the drum bus itself. So for spending 30 seconds on it, that's a cool sound. Let's turn it on and off so you can hear the differences. It just glued a lot of things together. The kick and the snare are punchier. The rest of the kit kind of has a little bit of a vibe to it. And it's just cool, especially on the verses when it's just kick, hi-hat, and snare. just nasty in the best way. So the pros of this approach, the top-down approach, are it's fast, it's efficient, which means you can get more mixes done in less time, which is pretty great. And it also creates a cool vibe. There's something about processing everything together, especially with compression, that just creates a vibe that you can't really get in any other way. Now, that vibe might not be right for every song, but when it's right, it's really right and it's delightful. What are the cons of this approach? The big one here is that you can sacrifice some of the clarity in the cymbals when you do this. If we go to the chorus section, you'll have what's called pumping, where the compressor is being hit and triggered by the kick and the snare, which is causing the cymbals to do that whoosh, whoosh, whoosh thing. So the cymbals don't actually sound like that, right? But when the compressor is responding to the kick and the snare, the cymbals they're kind of collateral damage in that scenario. Now, pumping in the cymbals can be a cool thing. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but sometimes depending on how the cymbal mics sound, it may or may not be too much. So here's what that sounds like. Listen to what the cymbals do when the kick drum hits. You'll hear them do this like they're sinking down. That's the compressor. That's one of the downsides, or at least the side effects of bus compression. So one solution is maybe when you apply the compression, you realize the cymbals are a little too loud. So maybe you pull down the overhead a little bit, or maybe you ease up on the compression so the pumping's not so hard, or maybe you just say, I'm okay with it. I want something really vibey and heavily compressed, and that's what I'm going for. Then you're good to go. The second approach to drum mixing is the bottom-up approach. So we talked about top-down. Bottom-up isn't bad. I've probably framed it as bad in the past just because I love top-down so much. But there are scenarios where maybe this makes more sense. And what I mean by bottom-up is what I was describing before, where you're mixing the individual kick, the snare, the tom, the overheads. Everybody's getting treated separately. They may still run to a drum bus, and you may still do some drum bus processing, but you're really getting the core of your tone from the individual tracks themselves. This can work. You just have to be really careful and aware that what the kick drum sounds like I said before, by itself, is not necessarily what it sounds like in the mix. But certain styles of music, maybe there isn't maybe you don't have the fat mic and the room mic. Maybe it's just kick, snare, and overheads, and maybe you just really want the brightness of the cymbals and the overheads and nothing else. I mean, just by turning down the room mics and that fat mic, it completely changes the way this drum kit sounds. So if we need a mix that's real dry, real kind of straightforward, then maybe we bring that overhead down and maybe we focus primarily on the kick and the snare individually, to the point where we might just mute everything but kick and snare and EQ them independently, compress them independently, probably like you're used to seeing. This would be the default mode if you're not sure how to mix drums. This is just kind of the natural, well, I guess I just start with EQ on the kick drum and go from there. So quickly, I'll put something together on this. Okay, honesty time. I just tried twice to do a bottom-up mix, and it has been so long since I've worked this way, I wasn't able to get much of a good result, especially on this kick drum. Partially, you could say, hey, Joe, you didn't record that very well, because this is kind of the tone I'm getting. It's just kind of a muffled, it doesn't have a lot of like attack to it. But I realized when I think about this recording session, we were listening to everything in context. So we listened in solo just briefly to make sure the tone was okay. But really, the whole sound of the kick drum was with the overheads, the rooms, and that fat mic. And since I've been in such top-down world for so many years, I knew that would give me the drum mix that I wanted. So if you were to try a bottom-up approach with this kick drum, I don't think you would get very far, because it's not really the kind of kick drum that works for that. Where bottom-up approach works really well is when you're working with pristine samples, electronic music, things like that, where the sound itself is almost exactly what you want by itself, from a sample, like a drum program, or like actual like drum machine samples. And then bottom up makes a lot more sense. It doesn't really make sense to kind of squish a bunch of electronic drums together to create vibe, because the whole thing is all the mics are picking up all the other pieces of the kit a little bit, and that's what makes that vibe when you kind of squeeze it down with compression. So I said top down was my favorite. Bottom up is a legitimate approach. It's just not one that I do, and honestly not one that I'm very good at. Technique number 3, route the overheads to the mains. So the main drawback to top-down mixing is what I showed you about the overheads and the pumping and breathing. So this is almost like top-down version 2, where we take our top-down approach that we have here, and instead of keeping the overheads routed to our drum bus, we just come in and we literally just route them to our main outputs. So now the overheads are bypassing the drum bus altogether, which means what? It means the drum bus compression is no longer affecting our cymbal sounds. And by doing that one change, we get this sound. It's a lot clearer in the top end. There's still a little pumping because the room mic also has a lot of cymbals in it. So if that's the case, we could route the room mic to the main outputs as well, and we're ending up with this. This is a really cool, almost like a hybrid approach of the first two, because we're grouping a bunch of tracks together and using a single compressor and EQ to kind of give them a vibe, but there's no side effects there to the cymbals that come through as clearly. And so if you're for me, I start with the first approach, top-down mixing. If that's not working or the cymbals are being wonky, then I'll do this, where I'll route the cymbals to their own bus or out to the main outputs, avoiding the drum bus altogether, and that usually solves whatever problem I'm hearing in the mix. A lot of people avoid drums because this stuff seems confusing to them, and that's sad because it means you avoid using drums in your production at all, which means you're really limiting what kind of stuff you can do, especially if you're a singer-songwriter like me. There's only so many different acoustic guitar vocal versions of a song I want to do. I want to expand. I want to do big full band stuff. And even if you're not set up to record that stuff, there are plenty of people online to collaborate with who can give you drum tracks, and you're going to want to make sure you know how to deal with them. So hopefully this gets you started down the path of becoming confident in your abilities to mix drums. By the way, in case you missed it at the beginning, if you haven't checked out the Recording Revolution Radio Ready Guide, which shows you how to get from start to finish, get your music sounding ready for the radio or wherever you want to put it, head over to recordingrevolution.com, enter your email address, and you can download that for free. Thanks for watching. See ya.